So if you were in those verses, we get what we get all the way through all the teachings of the Buddha, that the path is about peace, and peace is the giving up of clinging to wrong views. It comes up again and again, and we were looking at that last time when we were looking at the Kaccayana Sutta, where the Buddha says, right view, what's right view? And then he more or less says, well, it's not having a view. This is what keeps coming up again and again. It's not grasping a view that you then hold as your fixed position. It's looking at reality and then not holding a view. So when you look at suffering, if you look at the paticca part of the whole process of suffering, or you could say the mandala of suffering, or samsara, you wouldn't say it didn't exist. You wouldn't have the view, it does not exist. He doesn't say particularly you would have the view, it does exist, but you wouldn't have the view, it doesn't exist. So you're not going down the route of nihilism. Just nothing matters, nothing exists, there isn't anything. You're not going down that route because you're looking at suffering, the First Noble Truth. Then when you see the Third Noble Truth of the cessation of suffering, you wouldn't say, again, you wouldn't have a view, but you wouldn't say that samsara and the suffering did exist. Because from that point of view, it's a cessation of all those kinds of views. And everything that brings, that holding views is from holding a wrong view of self, wrong view of reality. And then that we notice that in our meditation the whole time, how we keep making things up that are not true. And it's that when that ceases, you don't say everything that I created existed. It never existed. But while it's going on, you wouldn't say it didn't exist. So it's like a dream, isn't it? While you're dreaming and you don't notice it's a dream, you wouldn't say it wasn't happening. You're not having a nightmare. You wouldn't say I'm not having a nightmare, because you are. But then when you wake out of it, you wouldn't say that it ever existed, actually. That hellish scenario didn't ever exist. So it's really interesting that the Kaccayana Sutta says that so clearly. And also the Madhyamaka Karikas, there's one verse, I think it's chapter 18, is about self. And I've been looking at quite a lot this last few weeks. And verse 6, I think it is, says, the Buddha used the term self. We all use the term self. And he also taught not self. So he taught using the term self, and he taught what is not self. But he didn't teach there is a self, and he didn't teach there isn't a self. And that's quite a subtle difference, which the more you meditate on it, the more significant you realize that is. So even though I'm going to be talking about self in a very positive way, I'm avoiding falling into the trap of saying there is a self. On the other hand, I'm going to be using the term because, and this is what I want you to discuss this afternoon, when we use the term, how are we using it? What do we understand as we say it? It's highly significant. We use it in different ways, and so do all the commentators on the Buddha's words. And the Buddha used the term, And I wanted to talk about, from this book, about some of the ways that I found surprising, that I didn't realise the Buddha actually spoke that way. So that's what I'm going to talk about next, is this book by Pere Raymond, Self and Non-Self in Early Buddhism. Now, I seldom read a good review on this book, and I've read a number of extremely bad reviews, in the sense of not only are they bad-mouthing it, but they're not using any good arguments at all. It's a very tightly argued book, so deserves a tightly argued review or objections to it. But most of the objections start from the basis of, well, the Buddha taught there's no self, and he's saying that the opposite, the Buddha taught the self. So obviously it's wrong, and it's a load of rubbish, and that's the end of the argument. So the only sensible review I read of it, I've forgotten who it was by, did describe very well what he's doing in the book, and then ends with a kind of very negative comment about something that I agree I wouldn't go along with either. But I would still recommend the book. I mean, you hardly ever find a book where there's not something you disagree with, if you're like me. But what he contributed to my understanding was that I had assumed that the Buddha taught there's no self. And then when you talk about anything positive, it's Buddha nature or something else that's although I did know that Buddha nature is called self, so that seemed, the great self. So I thought, oh well, okay, there's something going on there. But what he showed was that, what he shows in the book is, if you look at right across what he calls the Nikayas, or the suttas, the Sutta Nikayas, when you look across them in the Pali, all the uses, all the times he's talking about self, atta, and all the times he's talking about not self, anatta, he uses the terms equally often. And he uses the term atta in a positive way very often. Now, scholars know this, and they also know that there's no instance of the Buddha saying there is no self. So this is not new. But what is new is to compare it with the things that he says about self. And scholars up to this point, and still do, kind of say, well, although he uses the word self, he doesn't really mean anything by it. It's just like part of the linguistic structure of referring to yourself. Something referring to yourself. If something refers to itself, then it uses self. But that doesn't mean anything, which is a very difficult position to maintain. It's what he's mainly arguing against, that this is, you cannot justify that way of talking that the Buddha used. That's called reflexive. Oh, he just uses it as a reflexive pronoun, that's all. He's not really saying anything about the self as such. But I think he gives plenty of evidence. I mean, so much evidence, I don't know where to begin. So I'll just give a few examples at random, I suppose. So he's talking about the Buddha. The Buddha is this is on page 18, it's just a quote of, he's reported to have said of himself, this is towards the end of his life, "My age is fully ripe, my life is at an end. I shall depart, leaving you. I have made a refuge for the self." So he's used it. I made a refuge for, you wouldn't have a though in the, I've made a refuge for self. I've made a refuge. He uses it again. It's not just the one time that he uses it. Oh yes, there's a very interesting one where he says, he's talking to Malika, that's the mother of Shrimala actually. "Is there by any chance any other dearer to you, Malika, than the self? And again, you wouldn't have the there in the original, it's just than self. The answer is unequivocal. Unequivocal. There is not, by any chance, any other dearer to me than the self. And then the Queen returns the question to the King, who answers in the same strain. After that, the King reports the conversation to the Buddha, who corroborates the sentiments of the royal couple, and the sutta ends with the stanza, going around all quarters with the mind, not a thing was found dearer than the self. In this way, this is a curious one, I can't quite understand this one. In this way, the self of everyone is dear to others. Therefore, one who loves the self should never hurt another. But there's something in that. I would like to be able to understand that better. Yes, so there's a clear distinction there being made when we even hear that. Oh, it can't mean self-centeredness, can it? Because self-centeredness, we would know, was not going to be praised by the Buddha, praised by the wise. So we have to understand it, that the self that's being talked about is something, very important. There's no love comparable to that of self. Again, one should not impair the good of the self for the sake of the good of others. That's interesting, isn't it? However great, having ascertained the good of self, let him be ever intent on it. So this is very much coming, each time I'm reading that, I'm putting my hand here on my heart. What I truly am, I owe it to all beings to realize to actually take care of what I truly am. And we do use self like that, don't we? If a man were to think the self dear, he would guard it well. He would guard it, well guarded. The wise man should be watching in every one of the 3 watches of the night to guard the self. So this actually, when I was reading that, I was thinking, this opens out into that kind of way of thinking of the self as mandala. Because, if you think, what do I mean when I say self? And kind of defending myself or guarding myself. So if it was selfish, defending myself, I'd have this very tight feeling of defending myself. But if I was guarding who I am in myself, that would be a very strong place, and I would be guarding it with this mandala of my awareness. I would be watching out from that place that I wasn't actually allowing that other kind of defensiveness to come in. I wasn't going to try and defend a wrong position. I was going to try and be honest and open and clear and true to myself. And then that would be a strong, relaxed kind of openness, which I would need to guard with my awareness, with my attention, with my mindfulness. So I noticed that Trungpa Rinpoche was using mandala of samsara and mandala of nirvana. Sort of the mandala that you guard, that's your true nature or being, your mandala, your dharma guardians, and then you have your guardians of your samsaric view of self, like trying to defend something indefensible. You immediately get tight, don't you? So then, what I like about mandala, calling it a mandala, is you don't have to say what it is, other than there's that sense of it has a living structure to it. Is it whatever it is, it has that structure. Whether it's mind or, I don't know, mental, physical, emotional, quantum physical, whatever else it is, it's kind of has that structure. and that's a living experience. And I was thinking about how when I think of myself, my experience, I use this word, my experience, which isn't different from me. So I've used me and mine and self and my experience, and it's as if it's emanating from a point, a dimensionless point, a point that I can't pin down. That it has no dimensionless means it has no qualities in the sense of anything you can divide it into. It's a point of reference, central viewpoint, you could say even. I'm viewing reality from a certain point of view, and then that's like surrounds that point of view. It's the point of view that is the center of. And experientially, that's what I'm experiencing as myself. So there's bits of that mandala that are less important, and then the real essence of that mandala, which is all important. So it's like how far down the emanatory tree does it go? And it could be relatively unimportant, or it could be absolutely vital. And then when I say really, in my heart of hearts, in my real self, then I could actually dispense with a lot of that experience, because it's not. It's interesting to see why is that the case? And this is where you could make that distinction then between self and not self. So what's essential is self, and what isn't essential is not self. And that's very much the structure of the way. It's the structure of the way it's talked about, without even mentioning mandala. But I find it really helpful to have that perspective, or that lens, as somebody called it the other day, to look at what I mean by self. Yeah, I look at it like that. I have that sense of my experiences like that. And in that sense, you could take that as a refuge, couldn't you? Because this comes up again and again, with very famous lines about when the Buddha's passing away, and he says, take, and they ask, what should we do when you're gone? And he says, well, take yourself as your island, as your refuge. And immediately the next line he says, take the Dharma and your only refuge. Take yourself as your refuge and as your island and your only refuge. And your only refuge. And then he says, take the Dharma as your island, as your only refuge. So he's using them in parallel, very clearly there. And it sounds a bit audacious to start with. What, I am the Dharma. But actually that's what we're saying in the Praise to the Three Jewels, aren't we? There's the first verse is saying, the self awakens. So he's awakened. This is a reflexive use of self. But it doesn't mean that's, I don't think that's, when I say reflexive, it means that the awakening and the knowing is not different from the knowing. There isn't a knowing that's separate from the known in a way. You're self-awakened. It's awakened to its own nature. It's awkward in English to put it so simply, but self-awakened, awakened to itself, in itself, by itself. Nothing else is involved. It's just awakening. That's the Buddha. And then he cuts through the wrong views, the thicket of wrong views, which are the wrong views of self. I'm not sure we mentioned this last time, but certainly I think Dasha will talk about it tomorrow. The Sakkaya Dristi, the wrong views of self. So there's plenty of them. 4 for each of the skandhas, each of the 5 skandhas. And remember, when you say skandhas, you're talking about bundles. You're talking about something composite. They can be divided into moments or divided up into instances of something happening moment by moment. So they're not single things, the skandhas. So to think that the skandhas, these composite, constructed, sometimes called conditioned things, are the self is a wrong view. To think that these compounded, constructed things belong to the self is a wrong view. They're not attributes of the self. To think that they're in the self is a wrong view. And to think the self is in them is a wrong view. These are called and then it goes through them separately. So to think form is self, or to think the feeling is self, or to think the perceptions are self, or the samskaras are self, or the consciousness is self, is wrong view. So that's 20 wrong views. So the Buddha cuts through all those kinds of wrong views, and you go back to the Kaccayana Sutta, because actually you wouldn't say any of that was true. When you're looking at suffering, you wouldn't say it wasn't true, but when you're looking at cessation of suffering, you wouldn't say any of that was true. So you can't actually ultimately say the self is the skandhas. And there's a lot. I mean, you could spend a lot of time on each of those skandhas, looking at them and thinking, do I hold that view? Do I think I am my skandhas? Do I think I am my body? When I get defensive, if somebody insults my body, do I feel offended? If somebody doesn't take any notice of my feelings, do I think they've offended me? Is that me? Or my perceptions, if they well, it's an interesting one, that, isn't it? If somebody questions your perception, it's like a really attack on you, isn't it? You feel like you've been attacked. Somebody said, you're wrong. You haven't seen that right. That isn't what that is. Sort of my world. This is my perceptions are what I make my world out of, and kind of they're me. And then obviously all the kind of personality traits and all the various things that go on in my thinking, I assume that's me. And then the consciousness one is a really interesting one, because it's the consciousness of something. In English, we don't make a distinction between vijnana and jnana, or knowing and dualistically knowing. So this is definitely dualistically knowing, where you feel you know something. So I am the one that knows all of this. So you definitely think of yourself as you're being the one that knows it all. There's a definite division between you and what you know. And that's myself. And yet, I still think of that as in time, moment by moment. So, but I couldn't be just a single moment of consciousness. That wouldn't account for how I feel about myself at all. That would just be a passing moment. It's gone. So what gives me that sense of presence, of being, like the indestructible essence that's the source and foundation of my being? It can't be that kind of consciousness. And it's really worth coming back to these points again and again and again, because we keep slipping back into thinking in a vague way that somehow we do exist in time. I find the tone one in particularly very compelling. And I find the size in space another compelling one. I always think I somehow have a size in space. Some things are bigger than me, some things are smaller than me. And yet I can't find any basis for that. So you'll recognize here this is the kind of pointing out instructions you get in the oral transmission in the Buddhist tradition. Look, just keep looking, just keep looking. What are you actually experiencing? What are you actually seeing? And then coming back again, you're not negating your experience. You're not saying it isn't like that. You're just trying, there isn't, and I say it's not like that, it isn't that you can solve everything by saying there's no self. Or you can solve everything by saying, well, the self is all this collection of things. You've got to keep looking for what is that essential essence of our being. And when you look in the English dictionary for the meaning of self, I've looked in various dictionaries, they're all slightly different, but there seems to be an agreement that it's what something essentially is, or what one essentially is. It is what is yourself. So if it's not essential to you, it's not yourself. If it's not essential to it, it's not itself. It's what is it in itself, what is essential to it, which of course gets very close to how we use language in the Discovering the Heart of Buddhism, how we use it in the essential self, this indestructible heart essence, that which is not impermanent and changing and dying moment by moment. And the heart essence, the heart has so many connotations to it, doesn't it? Essence of our being. And that's how the Buddha is using self when he says there's nothing more dear, there's nothing more important. This is what you have to guard. This is where your volition, your heart wish is emanating from, your wish for happiness is emanating from. This is what you have to look after in order to look after others. If you're not looking after that, then your ability to look after others is severely impacted by that. So there's so many really interesting examples in here. Whenever I start reading it, I want to quote all of them, and yet it's surrounded by a sometimes rather strange choice of language. And I think the point that he was criticized most for is that in bringing out these two, the atta, the self, and the anatta, and contrasting them, he's thinking, well, this is two contrasting equal realities, which you could question that is actually what the Buddha's doing. Nonetheless, I have to say, when I read in Orderly Chaos, Trungpa Rinpoche's book on Mandala Principle, he quite shocked me by saying, well, the mandala of samsara and the mandala of nirvana are equal. And I'm thinking, well, no, the mandala of samsara is like in the Katrayana, that you wouldn't say that existed. But the mandala of nirvana, which is peace, which is the cessation of all prapancha, you wouldn't say that was equal to samsara. So it's a statement that needs handling with care. And I think one needs to treat this with the same sort of respect. What exactly Remon is saying here? And he does sort of speculate a little bit. Most of the time he's not speculating. Most of the time he's very tightly arguing and quoting and arguing against the current view, which is still the current view actually, that the Buddha didn't say anything. He didn't use the word self in this positive way. And he's showing you can't really interpret these so many passages where it is used in this positive way. You can't really dismiss them, and he argues that case very well. And then he also shows how what the Buddha was saying is that what we grasp as self, which is impermanent and constructed and leads to suffering and is suffering, is not the self. So he's saying it's not self, it's not self. And certainly in all the instructions I've had from my own teachers about self and not self, that message comes across, very clearly, that what we're grasping as self is not self. And they don't tend to, in the Mahamudra tradition, they don't tend to use self very often for what's our true nature. They're more likely to use true nature, nature of mind, chitta, nature of chitta. They're more likely to use language like that. And I think there's a historical reason why they've changed the language somewhat. But it's not completely different from how the Buddha uses chitta from time to time. So those are my comments about this book, that that's basically the structure. Half of it's about atta, half of it's about anatta, and some very, very interesting quotes. Unfortunately, he refers to suttas with sutta references of a system that's not the one that you normally find when you're looking for sutras, so it needs a bit of conversion. But the person to ask about that is Dashu. He'll tell you how to convert it. But it's interesting how this book has been totally ignored, and every book I pick up that's been written since, they still keep saying the Buddha taught there's no self, or any sense of self is going to lead to suffering. It's still current. So and it's a shame, because actually if you make that slight adjustment to, rather than saying there's no self to saying the skandhas are not self, if you're always careful to do that, it's really elegant. It kind of links the teachings all the way through in a very clean way. It's only a slight adjustment. Just to always remember to say, these impermanent and changing and constructed, grasped at things are not self. They're not me. And it's another interesting point that I'm kind of looking at, to see how self is, like in Tibetan, self is dak, and in Sanskrit it's atman, and in Pali it's atta. And it's used sort of alongside a kind of reflexive pronoun, like in Tibetan it would be rang, Sanskrit it would be sva, so svabhava, or self-awakened would be rang, awakened to, and also even in that verse, realized by the self, but is realized in itself, by itself. So the use of those terms of reflexive pronouns for the self, we do it in English as well, don't we? It's the same thing, self-awakened, self-realized, self-liberated. Has a slightly different use of self to who I am really in myself. But I don't think that means they're not talking about the same, I don't think it's hugely significant, because we're not going to talk about self as something that we can grasp as something known by us anyway. Because when you look and you try to find the self, you can't find it. And why can't you find it? Because you are it, So that's self-reference, and it's awkward to talk about because you are it. And as soon as you're not it, it isn't the self. So if you're looking at it from outside itself, it's not the self anyway. It's something constructed. And I think we all notice that in our meditation, don't we? It's sort of strangeness of that. What am I protecting in the end? Does it need protecting? So there's self, there's the my self, and there's me, I, So we tend to use I in both senses as well, don't we? I'm just thinking about myself. That's selfish. Or I'm going to put myself really behind this. That's not that selfish I, is it? It's that power of self, which is another interesting use of self, which I've come across in recent, I suppose, only the last year really, talking about internal family systems, where they talk about self-energy. And I was thinking about that overnight and thinking, oh yes, in Tibetan, when you talk about this self as, the skandhas can't be the self because they're impermanent, because they're not singular and they're not independent. The word for independent is rangwang, and rangwang is self-powered. So I thought, oh, that's very close to the IFS sense of self-energy, and also what that sense of your mandala, you having, your mandala of your experience. And if that's liberated, then you have this self-power to do to act in this spontaneous and clear, enlightened way. You're not bound by all these wrong views that are getting you caught up in sub-personalities that are fighting for attention and all that kind of business. It's like these are all aspects of this mandala of your experience that is self-powered. And it isn't impermanent. It doesn't die with you, which of course allows for karma to go from life to life because it's in your mandala, which isn't bound to the skandha of this body. So, and also you can talk about a mandala without it being something that exists or not exists or both or neither. You can just use the term without it getting involved in whether it exists or not. Same as the Buddha is using self. He's not saying it exists or it doesn't exist, he's just using the term. And we can use mandala in that same way. And I think self and mandala both have that quality of including everything. Whereas if you use chitta or mind, there's still a sense that there is something that isn't mind, the other side. Whereas if you use self, that's your whole of your experience. It includes everything in your experience. And mandala is the same. It includes everything in your experience. So it doesn't favour more, it implies inside and outside, but there isn't established that there's an inside and outside that you can fix. But nonetheless, there's the dynamic of inside and outside, self and other, which is essential to the nature of experience, isn't it? So I think there's a lot to be said for making these central terms in a way that perhaps Buddhism hasn't done because of this kind of anti-self culture, like we're not going to use self as our key term because we're talking about not self. And especially if you think Buddha taught there's no self, then you can't use it as a central term. But I think we can use it as a central term, and it's not moving away at all from how the Buddha was using it, which is very convenient, isn't it? Very elegant and convenient. And that relates very strongly to how we use the word person and being, because these are the words that we can use for, like, what am I? What am I? what am I? Myself, you self, I. And you use it reflectively, like. And then there's the reflexively. And we also use this word person. And personal mandala, like what's my personal experience? My personal experience. We all know what we're talking about, don't we? It's kind of, we can be confused about it, but we know what we're talking about. Person. And each of us is a person. A Buddha is a person. Now, there was a lot of discussion about whether the Buddha was a person, because he wouldn't say he was or he wasn't. He wouldn't say he was a human, for example, because he'd gone beyond the human realm. And he wouldn't say anything that meant that you could have a view that he was stating categorically, this is a. But at the same time, this is the case. But he does use I, and he does speak as a person, like in that first quote I gave. I'm getting old, and I'm taking refuge in the self, in this self energy, if you like. I just take refuge in that, and I'm not trying to hang on to anything and do too much, maybe. And he definitely is a person, because he's got a life story. He kind of, he's got his world, his teachings, his legacy. There's a definite sense in which you're talking about a person, and that's interesting. As I'm saying that, I must be careful I don't lose track of what I'm saying, but I was thinking about the Duke of Edinburgh today, of course, and thinking how good it was that at 12 we'd be sitting in meditation during the gun salutes, and everybody, the whole country really, the whole world really, showing respect for a person who's really worthy of respect. 70 years of public service, and when people die, you hear more about their qualities, don't you? And for me as well, I think I was surprised how I teared up when I heard the news, and I thought, gosh, that really surprised me. I didn't realise. I know I loved the Queen, but I thought I didn't realise I also loved Prince Philip. And then I was, listening to all the things that were being said, and then there's the Bishop of Dover. What's her name? Rose Hudson, I think her name is. She was the chaplain to the Queen for a while, and she gave a very moving. Somebody asked her, what did she think the Queen would be feeling and how she would cope with it? And she said she will cope with it because of her faith, and because he's still with her in her heart. His spirit is still there with her in her heart. The rock that he was for her will still be with her in her heart. And I thought, what she's saying is so profound, so true. That is what is that essence of that person? That's 70 years, over 70 years of connection with the Queen, a heart connection, and somehow personally, I go tingly when I think of what that heart connection means, and therefore what that means to be a person. That even now his body's gone, what he is as a person is not in time anywhere, never was. And I really believe that. And the same with the Buddha. The Buddha, okay, his physical presence in the world is perhaps gone, but then that world that he was in is gone as well. But what he is hasn't gone anywhere. And I can still relate to that. I can still open out to that. I can still let go of all my small thinking and deluded and confused thinking, and then that presence of the Buddha is just lives on. It doesn't belong to what is impermanent and changing and unreliable and incomplete and can be broken into bits. It doesn't belong to that at all. It's a completely different subject matter. Seems a bit weak. It's a completely different reality. And it's not in time. So we come back to this same mysteriousness of continuity in time when we've constructed it from our ideas about it. It's quite nihilistic because, past is gone. I mean, what's the point of thinking about it, Future, well, who knows what that's going to be, and so what's in between. So it's completely nihilistic, actually, if you really think about time. And everything that matters is not in time, actually. If it's alive, it isn't in time. It's reality. It can't be broken up in that way. And this is the message that comes over again and again. Construction is made of parts which are built up into something. And then this is what quantum physics is discovering, that actually reality isn't like that. You can't build it up out of bits. It just isn't like that. And if we actually understood quantum physics, which I don't, but I get this impression, if we even began to understand it, that whole view would collapse. But would we then apply it to our life or not is another question. As a physicist, we might, but actually how we lived our life, maybe we don't. Maybe we don't take it on board. But if we're doing something even more radical, actually, when we're looking to drop all that trying to construct a conceptual version of reality around our direct experience of reality. That's what we're doing. This is what prapancha are. This is what we're doing all the time, and this is what suffering is. And then peace, nishprapancha, where that's not going on at all, is the end of suffering, it's nirvana, it's Buddha. And what then opens up is the whole of reality, which turns out to be, astonishing. Astonishing. What we think of as reality is just so puny compared with what there is to discover, to realize. I often wonder when scientists get excited about going off to sort of bits of old rock in the middle of nowhere, miles from anything, and think, isn't that exciting? And I think, well, in the scheme of things, no. It's rather puny. It's just a bit of bare rock. Why would you want to go there? When you could actually, the whole of, the whole thing is completely full of, countless beings in countless shapes and forms and states of being, and it's packed full of that. I'm not that interested in old bits of rock, but it is very clever to manage to get out there and find out things. I admire that. Anyway, that's a digression. So that's what I wanted to say about this book. And then I wanted to move on to talk about, which I have done actually, about I've had so many ideas running up to this talk. I've forgotten what I ended up deciding to talk about. Yeah, so the idea of looking at what is not self, and to really recognize, as we did the last weekend, about how grasping at what is not self as self is a wrong view, and that grasping is actually, everything's created out of that grasping, is suffering. So when we can really see that, we see that first noble truth of suffering and the second noble truth of the cause of suffering, it produces in us this revulsion, this turning against that clinging. And that's based on faith. So faith that there is actually something else to aim for, that isn't the whole story. And then really rejecting everything that you've been clinging on to, is a major process. And I could have spent this whole talk or a whole week or a whole year talking about how we grasp at what is false and continue to grasp at what is false, and how when you really see the suffering that is, then we would have this opposite sense, and I think this is maybe what Dashi will talk about tomorrow, this real sense of revulsion and giving it up. And this is, in the Mahamudra tradition, this is really stressed, that the whole process of realizing our true nature is based on a complete revulsion for everything that's suffering, which is caused by this grasping at wrong views. So there's a real revulsion for that. If you don't have that strongly enough, as you open out into the spacious, groundless nature of reality, you're going to panic and try and grasp again at something that seems more, more graspable. And so you really have to have conviction that is not going to work. And even if you only learn that in this life, you've made a good use of your life. It isn't going to work. It isn't going to work. It's useless. It's just useless. It isn't going to work. It's only going to be suffering. So it's not a matter of I'm going to make a big sacrifice and be a Buddhist and practice Dharma. No, you're not sacrificing anything other than the actual suffering. You're going for what isn't suffering. You're not sacrificing anything of any worth. That has to become very strong. And I'm really convinced that goes with us from life to life, that once anything we learn in that direction, I really believe carries with us into our next life. Because I meet so many people who are in Buddhism and who follow a spiritual life, and they've been like that from childhood, and they can't even explain why. It's not even in their background. Their siblings didn't take it up. I think so many of you will have this same story. And that makes me feel encouraged, because I think, so this is something that if in this life, to the extent I develop that kind of enunciation, to that extent I will definitely take it to my next life and get a good start in life with the right sort of orientation. So it can't be stressed enough, really, even if one doesn't feel, sometimes one might feel a bit intimidated by these higher teachings that think, well, it doesn't matter if you've actually got this revulsion for attachment to things that are just suffering. You will find your way, because you are the Dharma, and the Dharma will come through you. The Dharma will find you and come through you. So it's quite powerful that the Buddha said that. I mean, I thought that was a later teaching, and the Triyana system would have you believe this was a later teaching, but no, the Buddha was saying this, and the Buddha kept saying, "I'm telling you everything. I'm not leaving anything out. This isn't a watered down, dumbed down version that I'm teaching you. I'm teaching you, the ultimate truth." And it's very encouraging to see that actually when we talk about the ultimate truth, it's exactly the same as what the Buddha is teaching in these early suttas. I find that it gives us confidence as Western Buddhists, I think, that we don't have to get too involved in what's happened over the centuries, the different toing and froing of different philosophical schools, that we can actually take the oral tradition we've got through our own Mahamudra, Dzogchen tradition, and we can link it to what the Buddha is saying right at the start, and be more relaxed about what all these other things have been going on. I mean, they might be useful, they might not be, but it's not so overwhelming as to think you've got to learn 2,500 years of historical development. Actually, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha was teaching in a way that's totally accessible to us, especially because we have this living tradition still, this meditative tradition of how to look. And we've got teachers who are teaching it, and the power of the Adhisthana of that coming through. So I feel that makes it very hopeful for the Buddhism in the West. Yeah. I'm doing what I knew I would do, which is keep digressing. How am I doing for time? A bit more time, haven't I? But not time for the main part of my talk, which, as it happens, I've put a lot of stuff up on this website, the Google site, just to give some indication of where we might be going with this over the years to come. I did give a course to the Tech Chok link to Mapa Network Khenpo Rinpoche students a few years ago. They asked me to teach on the progressive stages of meditation on emptiness, and I started looking at the first one, the Shravaka view, and of course, because I've been rethinking this so much, I wasn't really in the mood for doing it in that particular way. But I was very taken with the way Milarepa taught the shepherd boy. So I think I gave several talks on that story with the songs, and what I liked about it in particular was it showed how Milarepa had got his shepherd boy student to look for himself, look in his direct experience as honestly as he could to find his self. And just like any child, he kind of, he knew, he had an idea what self was and started looking for it. And then he was surprised because he couldn't find it, and he got really confused. And then he started switching from mind to, he could sort of find the body, but he couldn't find the mind. So he could see that the self wasn't the body, but he couldn't see what the mind was even. And then he comes back, and then Milarepa, he says, I can't find it. I'm confused. I don't know. And now I think we can all recognize that. We look for ourselves, we can't find it. We look for our mind, we can't find it. And that's at the point at which Milarepa, and this is the oral transmission here, he says, that is the realization of not self. So, of the person. And I thought, it's strange because he isn't actually, in a way, realizing anything except saying, help, I can't find anything. And I notice that with students all the time. As they get clearer, as they drop their assumptions, as they stop being so confused, they start to report, I'm confused. Actually, they're actually dropping their confusion, and that's emotionally disorientating. But actually, they're getting clearer, and the way they're communicating with me is clearer, and I can relate to it better because it's very honest and very open, and then it's easier to kind of point further how they might take that further. And then Milarepa says to him, and now you need to spend, I think it was 12 years, studying the not-self of the Dharmas. So you've realized the not-self of the person, but you haven't realized the not-self of the Dharmas. And this is an area which I want us as a Sangha to discuss quite a lot over the years to come, because this is a Mahayana introduction of a distinction between the self of the person and the self of the Dhammas. And I wonder if it hasn't arisen from this switch from talking about believing that the Buddha taught there's no self, and then, okay, so the self of the person, there's no self of the person, but then somehow there could be the self, the Dhammas could have a reality, and that also has to be questioned. But if you go from the way the Buddha taught originally, the self is not in the skandhas, because the skandhas are not self. So why would you need two stages? So I think it's something that, as a whole, we need to get a bit more clear about that. What's happened there? Why is that being switched around, and what effect that has on our practice or not? And is it a good stage of the practice? Is it a good way to break the practice into stages, or is it just as good or even better to miss out that stage and just go straight for looking at the true nature of your being? That's another word, being, your true nature of your own true nature, your own true self. And notice in the Mahamudra pointing out instructions, they often don't include looking for self at all. They go straight for looking at the nature of mind. And I think that, it's interesting, isn't it, to see what the choices they've made when they're teaching. So I've got this document here that says comparing approaches to the teaching, not self. And there's another one that's very similar, or starts off very similarly, called Stages of Meditation on Not Self, I think. Stages of Meditation on Self in the Buddhist tradition. So I haven't had time to kind of integrate them into one thing. I'm not quite sure how they relate to each other. So you've got them put up there in a state of that's not really finished, but it might anyway be quite helpful in your reflections or in your thinking ahead of how you want to study or familiarize yourself with this whole topic. So in that, I start off by saying Milarepa and the Shepherd Boy as an example of an approach. And this would be like in the oral tradition how it's done. And it moves from what is me to what is my mind. I can't find it. Then you recognize the need to go deeper. And then you follow the Guru's instructions. So it's very much devotion to the Guru based. And then it's got this statement, well, you need to understand the not self of the Dharmas. And I'll come back to that when we come to one of the Mahayana approach. So then the next approach is one that I've been talking about this morning, really, is what the Buddha said in the Pali Suttas. So you look at what is constructed or compounded, and you see it's impermanent, and so suffering and unsatisfactory and not self. And then you look at what's compounded, and that's the samskaras are impermanent. All that's compounded is suffering, not self. And then nirvana is opposite of that. It is peace. And you might recognize this as the Four Seals. I don't know when, I think it's in one, Contra, Siga Contra or Zongsa Contra. The book called Why I'm Not a Buddhist. And in there he talks about these Four Seals. I think it's in there. But it's a standard formula for what defines Buddhism. It's a bit like the catechism. It's sort of like the statements these are the given statements in Buddhism that everything, dukkha, everything it's compounded is impermanent. That's the first. Everything that's compounded, or dukkha, is suffering. Often in Tibetan Buddhism, that's called zakche, which means asrava, having outflow. But there's a whole discussion going on around that. But it's often also put in the same as the first one. All compounded things are impermanent. All that is compounded is suffering. That's the second. Third one, all dharmas are not self. So there's a lot of discussion about that, especially in the Thai tradition, about why did it not say all compounded dharmas are not self, but instead it says all dharmas are not self. So then does that mean nirvana is a dharma and is also not self? So in Thailand this is a huge debate. As a young Thai student of Rupert Gethin, who came to see me once, and he wrote his whole MA thesis about this big debate that's been going on for decades, public debate. I mean, it's really lively debate in the newspapers about what is true Buddhism and whether nirvana is or is not compounded, which seems bizarre because how could it be not self? That's right. Was nirvana? What did the Buddha teach? There's no self, and nirvana is not self, or is it that nirvana is peace, which is the fourth one, which means it's beyond any kind of prapancha. Any peace always means beyond prapancha, beyond nishprapancha. Those of you who've done Trusting the Heart of Buddhism will recognize that term. Nishprapancha. It's nothing that can be grasped even quite subtly. And if there's no grasping at all, even the most subtle grasping, then that's peace, that's nirvana. And I think that would be. I don't think there's any Buddhist school that would not say anything different from that. So then, all dharmas are not self. Does that mean nirvana is not self, or all compounded dharmas are not self, which leaves the self as being what is not compounded, which is more like the Kachayana Sutta. It could be that it's not from our point of view, we could read it both ways, but if you're really a champion for there's no self, it's a really important point. Yeah. And then in the suttas again, you've got skandhas are not self because they are compounded, impermanent, and suffering. So why would you say that the skandhas were self? I mean, why would you say that? Doesn't make any sense. So nirvana or self is free from the sakkaya tristi, those 20 wrong views, which that the word in Pali for these wrong views is conceit, which I think is rather nice. It's a good word, that, isn't it? You're holding these views out of your conceit, the conceit of thinking, I know it's like this, I know it's like that. It's conceit. You don't know. The conceit of wrong views about the self and the skandhas. And then I've put some of those quotes that I've given you this morning. And sort of a question there. This is really my research notes, if you like, of where I've looked and where I think we need to carry on looking. And then there's, in the Princeton Dictionary, it takes a different view, and it uses a different set of wrong views. And I'm not sure when they first come in. And also using this the Melinda idea that, when Nagasena is talking to Melinda, King Melinda, isn't it? He's saying, well, the carriage, if you look for the carriage, you just find parts, but you don't find a carriage. So there isn't a carriage. In the same way, when you look for the self, you just find parts, which means there isn't a self. And that doesn't come from the actual suttas. It's a later, and one feels that that's actually started to go wrong already when it's talking like that, as if there isn't a self at all. And the way the Princeton Dictionary lists the wrong views, it uses a form which I've seen often used that says not that the self is not in the skandhas and the skandhas are not in the self. Instead, it says the self is not in the skandhas and not outside the skandhas. Now, we could read that different ways, but if you're a champion for this particular, the Buddha taught there's no self, that would confirm it, because it's not in the skandhas and it's not outside the skandhas. So there's only the skandhas, so that means there's no self. So that formulation of those wrong views actually is, for the person who's got this view the Buddha taught there's no self, that's like confirmation. So again, you need to watch out for that. I don't know where that comes from, actually. It might be a way of reading the Madhyamaka Karikas, but as I said, from our point of view, from my point of view, you could read it both ways. You could read it as, well, it can't be grasped, so yeah, okay. But it's interesting that in the original, it was very clear that it was saying, it was using self is not in the skandhas, there's no self because the self isn't in the skandhas. It's so then I go on to the approach that Khenpo Rinpoche takes in his progressive stages of meditation in emptiness, and also how much meat there is in going through each of the skandhas and looking at how we do think they are a self, how we do identify with our body, we do identify with each of those skandhas, and then to see that that's, that can't be ourself. So, and it's interesting at the end, he doesn't say, so now meditate on the skandhas as not self. He says, now drop that whole way of thinking and open out into the spaciousness of your true nature, if you like, or the true self, you could say. So he makes this big jump from investigating to see if you can find the self in the skandhas, as if you can't find it, that's the answer. Don't go any further with that. Don't develop a view, so therefore the self is the skandhas, or the self is... Don't adopt any view, just let go of the whole thing and just relax into the space of your formless meditation, which is a really interesting approach. Yeah, and he sort of says, well, he tends to say things, that's right, he uses the dream as an example all the time. So in a dream, we can completely identify with a self that isn't ourself, can't we? So we're running away from somebody, and actually the one running away isn't really running away, and there's nobody running after them. So when you see that, you wake up. You don't then carry on meditating on the person running away and being chased and think they're not self. You just wake up and you just become simple. So it's quite an interesting use of the... saying it's like a dream and an illusion in that sense. When we realise, it wasn't like that at all. It never was. I don't need to do anything to make that better. It just never was. So that's another approach. And then I've got number 4, prevalent view of scholars. And you find this not just in Western scholars, but you find this right across every tradition. You've got this argument going on between scholars and meditators often, or meditating scholars. The Thailand debate is going on between a meditator scholar who had a meditation experience that he then couldn't explain by what he knew already, so he studied the scriptures again freshly, and he then started arguing from this other point of view, and the old hands, they kind of came back very strongly, and this person that I met, Cho Vijnan, he said, that he's writing to defend a view which is actually exactly the same view that I'm defending in Buddha Within. So he was very excited about that, because the same arguments were being used, everything was, it was obviously exactly the same discussion that has been going on in Tibetan Buddhism over the centuries. So that was quite interesting to know that, and that it's so alive today. It's by no means settled. So in this view, I think I've already covered this. It moves from there's no self in the skandhas to there's no self. The self is illusion. The only reality is the conditioned skandhas. And they do tend to translate it as conditioned rather than constructed, although samskara, duce, does mean constructed. Is made, kara, to make. But they use conditioned. And that's something, again, to consider. What happens when we use the word conditioned rather than constructed? What do we really mean? What are we really saying? Because it's very common, isn't it? I think in every Buddhist book you get conditioned used, don't you? And I'm not quite sure whether that says the same as constructed or not. Is it compounded, constructed? It's conditioned. It's slightly different. So I'm interested whether that matters or not. So this, yes, it raises the question of why the Buddha never says self is an illusion. He doesn't say that. He's saying that self is the only thing that matters, and he puts it alongside Dharma. So it doesn't quite make sense. And isn't saying the self is actually the skandhas one of the Sakaya Dristi, because that's exactly the first one. To say self is the form, any of the skandhas, is a wrong view. So how can they get around that? Anyway, they probably do. They've probably got their way of getting around that. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because we are going to be faced with this a lot. People coming back, Buddhists coming back at us and saying, the way you're teaching is well, or they just teach in a different way and you want to argue with them, you want to put them right. So you really have to know your stuff. So then there's the Mahayana presentation of self, of not self, which of course is the same as what Khenpo Rinpoche is doing essentially, but really emphasizing this sense of a difference between the not self of the self and the not self of the dharmas. I won't have time to go into that today, but it does come up in progressive stages, and it is interesting to just work out what exactly is going on there. Because haven't you already shown it? If you show that the self is not the skandhas, why would you need a separate stage of showing the skandhas, that all the dhammas that make up the skandhas are not self, or don't have, and they don't use self, they use svabhava. They don't have a svabhava, they don't have a, and I think that's because it's a reaction against what the commentators did after the time of the Buddha, when they started building up the Abhidharma and commentating on the Abhidharma. These ideas about these were the building blocks of reality. There's no self, so we're not nihilists. There is reality, but it's built up of these building blocks. And I think the Mahayana is a reaction against that. It doesn't react by saying, going back to what the Buddha said, they're not self. It reacts by saying, you say they've got svabhava, we say they haven't. Look, and then Nagarjuna argues how they don't have svabhava, so that they're not self, actually, but he doesn't. Well, actually, he does more or less say that. I think Nagarjuna is getting back to what the Buddha originally said. So there's a lot to look at there, and then seeing the Tathagata Sutras in that light. That they may seem to be, it's often they're accused of reverting back to the Vedanta view of self, or the Hindu view of self, and they're sort of looked at from that point of view, that they've reintroduced self. But I think not illegally, not illegitimately. In fact, it was always there. And they're using it in the same way that the Buddha used it, and they've developed those teachings further. But that's my thesis, I suppose, in Buddha Within. And then you've got Trungpa Rinpoche's presentation of not self, and he does something that I find extremely irritating, which is he uses the word ego. And he uses it almost as if it's synonymous with self, and it really isn't. If you're doing a translation, you can't use ego instead of Atman. It just isn't right. But it does have its place, because obviously, we talk about ego, we talk about, but then he talks about non-ego, and I think, well, yes, you could talk about non-ego, but that means not conceited, doesn't it? Somebody's no ego, they're really non-ego. It's a praise of them as a person who's not selfish or clinging to their own self-importance. He's got no ego, he's really kind of... But then ego is also used as being something that we really need in order to be a healthy mandala. We need to have a healthy sort of sense of self, or ego, and sometimes some psychiatrists are using the word using the word ego for that ego mandala, that self, that's our true nature or mandala. So I think it isn't a word that really exists in the original, and Trungpa Rinpoche was very good at using words how they were being used colloquially to make points, and I think he does that effectively. But nonetheless, I think when we're talking about self and not self, I think it's important not to think not self, anatta, is no ego or not ego. I think keep it in a separate, different kind of conversation, I think. But what he does is talk about the ego arising from the space of, our true nature, which is beyond prapancha. He was always talking about the spaciousness or groundlessness of nishprapancha, and then how does that turn into ego? And then he describes the process subjectively of how we then start to grasp, and He does that very effectively, and he describes the skandhas as that building up of this, the ego mandala, actually. He talks about it as I think he calls it the castle of ego. So it's a very interesting description of self being the samsaric mandala of how that paticca samuppada, if you like, is sort of it's another way of describing how those 12 links of paticca samuppada just kind of take over, and then we're suddenly in this mandala of samsara looking for a way out. So he's doing something very, very interesting there, but I think it really helps to have these other approaches clear in your mind first. And then as you go into that, you can really see, oh, wow, he's made a huge jump there. But it's exciting because it's so insightful and so practical as well. So then the last bit, I've put my own approach, which you've got hints of all the way through, really. Well, you know, how I'm using language and how what I try to avoid saying, which since I've been trying to avoid saying it all through the talk, hopefully those points don't need to be spelled out, but you've got them in these notes anyway. And that's not bad, 11. Okay, so I'm looking forward to hearing your results of your discussion this afternoon. I've sent the wording to Dashu, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Dashu's talking tomorrow. I'm expecting him to go into more detail into some of the points I've been making and maybe introducing a few extra ones, but there's so much to discuss here that I hope the effect of the weekend will just galvanize you all to be really, really interested in following this topic through over the years to come, and noticing in your own Dharma practice, in your own meditation practice, how these teachings affect you. So I want to hear from you how, you know, the word self is, how you find you're using it, different ways you might be using it, the ways you might have found teaching on no self has been helpful. Like I've made this big thing about no self. You might have practiced for years with no self, which I did, and found it really useful. So really look at that, you know, like how's it been useful, and where to go from there. And a whole area that I could have spent the whole time talking about is how you use teachings on self and not self as remedies for the kleshas. And we saw that last year when we were doing the apamanas, we saw how self-empathy was important. We also saw exchanging self for others was important. These are also different ways of playing with this whole self, not self thing that I'm just mentioning, so to kind of give you an overview of where we could go with this over the years to come. We dedicate this punya to the enlightenment of all sentient beings. May all sentient beings realize complete and perfect awakening. May the heart's awareness awaken in the unawakened. Where it has begun to stir, may it never fade, and may it awaken fully. Chanchu Semni Rinpoche Mache Panam Jejejik Jeva Nyamba Mapadam Kone Kondu Pelwasho. Chanchu Semni Rinpoche Mache Panam Jejejik Jeva Nyamba Mapadam Kane Kandu Pelwasho. Chanchu Semni Rinpoche Mache Panam Jejejik Java Nyamba Mapadam Kane Kandu Pelwasho. Thank you, everyone. Oh, just about get control of the subject. It's going everywhere.